Sustains. Their role is incredibly simple, do their best to keep your team alive. Both Genshin and Honkai Star Rail have plenty of characters that do that. And despite the fact that the way they work is so straightforward, some forms of sustain are better than others. More than that, in these two games, same type of sustains may be meta or completely unplayable. To figure out why all this happens, today we're gonna explore how they work, what's so special about them, and where the differences come from. Even if you don't play one of the games, stick around as there are gonna be plenty of information and comparisons within each one. So let's start with types of sustains. Overall, there are 3 big different kinds, each with its own pros and cons. Let's take a look at it one by one. First one is obviously healing. Whenever your characters lose some HP, these sustains can restore it. It works very similarly in both Genshin and Star Rail, so no differences so far. Before Furina got released, healers in Genshin weren't very popular. Some characters like Band that fulfill another role and just happen to heal were viable, but pure healers were not. Unless you were already strong enough and just needed some insurance, nobody really played them, even back in old days. In Star Rail, situation was a bit different. Healers weren't just a quality of life improvement, but an actual must. At certain point, Hoi introduced better forms of sustains, but even nowadays you can still play them just fine. So what gives? Responsible specifically for this difference is game mechanics, more precisely their genre. You see, Genshin is an action game, everything happens in real time. There are many ways to control enemies, denying their attacks, for example with CC from Kazuha, freeze, and even basic attack stagger. On top of that, Genshin has one very crucial mechanic, dodging. When you dash, you obtain certain amount of invincibility frames that allow you to ignore almost any damage. Or alternatively, you can just get out of attack range either by running away or getting in the air. Most important part is that you can easily avoid damage. Star Rail on the other hand has way less options. It's a turn-based game, meaning after you make your turns, it'll become enemies' turn to do their actions. There are some ways of denying their actions, similar to Genshin, such as freezing, breaking, stunning, or uniquely turn delaying. It wasn't really meta at any point so far, but the option is there. What matters more is that when enemies' turn inevitably comes, you can't avoid damage in any way. This small difference gives enemies an edge just enough to require you to run sustain. Similarly how in Genshin you can't fully rely on controlling enemies to avoid damage completely, you can't do that in Star Rail either. If the fact that normal slower clears result in enemies moving and dealing damage, the opposite is also true. If you manage to slay them fast enough, they won't possibly have opportunity to do anything. So-called zero cycle clears often abuse that, which allows them to play sustainless. Theoretically in Genshin it's possible as well, but usually a lot harder and require heavy investments. Though obviously in neither of these games average player would ever do that. To sum up all of these, healers in Genshin are not great because you can avoid being damaged, and good in Star Rail because you cannot. And despite that, even in Star Rail, healers are not the best kind of sustains as well as in Genshin. Our far better second type is shielding, even though for different reasons for each game. First of all, in case you don't know, let me explain in short how shields work. Basically, they give you an extra amount of HP on top of your usual, which can be healed and will disappear as soon as it gets depleted. There are some advantages for that over healing, but there are also some downsides. We'll talk about them in each explanation, so for now let's start with Genshin. If we look at it only from perspective of saving your team from death, then situation isn't much better than healing. You still can avoid most if not all of the damage, so it's just a quality of life improvement. But there is one thing that I haven't mentioned. In Genshin, when you get hit, not only it depletes your HP, but also staggers your character, making them unable to act for a certain time. For smaller hits it may be just few moments, but for big hits that send you flying it may take seconds. And unlike healing, shields do help with that. All Genshin shields have special traits that protect you from crowd control effects, that of course includes stagger from hits. On the first glance it may be hard to see how it's relevant, after all dodging is still an option, so that makes shield just a bit better of quality of life. And on one hand that's true, which is exactly why current meta is moving away from using sustains more and more. Shields already barely appear, and heals mostly get used just to enable Furina. But it's not just that easy. You see, dodging is still an action that also takes some time, which in turn means using it will lose your damage. Avoiding doing that and just keep attacking is a priority. Weirdly enough, in that sense, shield sustain actually increases your damage. Of course not as much as potential sub DPS or another support, but still wins some. Also there are some characters that have skills that require channeling, and canceling those for dash will result in even bigger damage loss. For example, Ganyu, Nuvolet, Lini, Chaska and many others. Obviously even for them shield is not a must, as even if you can't avoid damage by dashing, you can still do it by clever position outside of enemy's attack range. But all of these things combined is what makes shield better better option in Genshin, that is if you need sustain at all. Shield's benefits don't end there, and next one we'll discuss in Star Rail example, since in Genshin it doesn't matter that much. Once again, most general things about sustain that I mentioned in previous section apply here as well. So now let's talk about differences. You already know that shields are so good in Genshin because of CC protection, but there is no such thing in Star Rail. Instead, the fact that it basically increases your effective HP is what makes it amazing. You see, most healers to restore HP need to do something actively. It may be using their skill, ultimate, or simply taking a turn. The problem is that your actions are very limited during enemies' turns. Because most enemies have somewhat similar speed, it's not unusual to see several of them acting in a row. You still can use some characters' ultimates or passives as emergency healing, but both of those have pretty severe downtime. And at high level of endgame content, enemies tend to deal a lot of damage and your characters can only endure so much. If you get a bit unlucky and someone gets attacked several times in a row, they can just not survive till your healer gets opportunity to restore their HP. At that point, it doesn't matter how much they heal, even if it's more than full HP, you can bring them back from the other side. Of course, unless you're a cute small dragon lady. Sometimes situation gets even more severe, to the point where one single enemy can just one-shot your characters from full HP. Obviously, that's where shields shine the most. It allows your characters to endure way more damage before you can add another layer of protection. And of course, unlike heals, shields don't have any sort of cap. Even if it's 5 times bigger than HP pool, it's still gonna be fully effective. But once again, it also comes with downside. You see, if you receive damage that surpasses your shield strength, it will deplete some of your HP. And shielders don't have any way to restore it back. So if your shield is smaller than HP pool, it can theoretically be worse than healing in the long run. Because of that, the only situation when shield is always better than healing of the same amount is when it surpasses max HP and has 100% uptime. That's why character like Aventurine is considered one of the best sustains in the game, while Jeopard with Fire MC are barely being used. Again, to summarize all of it, shields prevail in Genshin mostly because of crowd control resistance they provide. In Star Rail they do because they offer so-called active protection, preventing your characters from being killed in between your turns. The reason why I said second thing doesn't apply to Genshin that much because nothing really stops you from switching back to healer whenever you're in dire need of that. Of course, there is still downtime and damage loss that it causes, but situation is not nearly as severe as in Star Rail. And obviously enemies that one-shot in Genshin almost don't exist. And finally third type, which is very rarely used. In fact, so rarely that both games have only one character of that type each. I'm of course talking about damage redirection. It's somewhat similar to shields in sense that it offers active protection by increasing effective HP. The main advantage of this type is its potential, as it basically provides a multiplicative increase to your HP. It also becomes exponentially better the higher percentage there is. This is probably the reason why these games don't want to release more of such characters. Of course, while your team enjoys the benefits, character that damage gets redirected to suffers all of it instead. So it is very important for such characters to have means of restoring their own HP. Thankfully, both Fushan and Dia have it in their passives. It's a bit hard to compare, their passives are equally good, but even if not, I doubt it's the main reason for their popularity. But let's go back on track. This is probably the biggest gap so far, as Fushan is widely considered the best sustain in the game while Dia almost never gets used. So why is it happening? First, let's look at the obvious case, Fushan. Fushan's damage redirection provides very similar advantages to shield. It protects your team from getting destroyed in between your actions, and as I mentioned in theory, does it way better than shields. The only problem with it isn't unlike with shields where enemies have to deplete it before doing damage, here you will receive it always. More often than not though, every late game mode is fast enough for it to not become a problem. You can just tank the damage, and self-heal for Fushan to keep her sustain alive is more than enough. Wanna mention that she does have a team-wide healing, which helps a lot in longer fights, but it's not that important. Even though you can run healing side, healing bonus body and just normally get more HP substats, nobody really bothers to do it. As long as you make sure Fushan herself stays alive, your team is probably in safety. Now let's go back to Dia. You see, things damage redirection provides is not that important in Genshin. Again, situation is very similar to shields that you don't actually care about sustain itself that much. Damage redirection by itself doesn't provide CC protection like shields, but thankfully Dia has it as part of her kit. The problem is that it doesn't have very good uptime and lasts only half of her skill duration, which pretty much makes it worse option than most of existing shields. Thus, Dia's only upside over shields is not very relevant, so the only thing that left is downsides. Don't get me wrong, she is still a very decent sustain and you can use her if you really want to, but going for the most efficient sustain, she is never gonna be an option. Of course, I'm talking only about sustain part of her kit. Some others like power application off-field may come in handy in different scenarios. So that's about all for sustains. Now you know why Star Rail and Genshin, despite having exactly the same sustain choices, have very different meta. If you enjoyed the video, leave it a like and consider subscribing, it really helps me out a lot. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next video. Have a great day.